What I'm saying is that before 2003, there was no way to directly visualize these planets. Okay, before 2003, basically you just looked at the radial velocities. That was the only evidence, and then there were other means that helped to confirm it. But there were multiple lines of indirect evidence. So you're describing direct visualization as what is absolutely necessary to confirm something.
What you're calling as indirect evidence or based on natural phenomena is what I am saying. So I can't go beyond a natural explanation and hypothesis as soul or spirit when I have a natural explanation. If you use a term that by any means can be verified, how can I say that it exists? It could still be imagination, it could be an assumption, and it may be based on faith because that person wants to or wishes to believe in that.
Thank you, Dr. Palavalli. Dr. Guy, would you like to respond to that?
Consciousness, it's very difficult to think of consciousness as something that is simply organic for a number of reasons. One problem is the nature of physics. For example, if you take an electron gun and you fire it through a wall with two slits in it, and nobody is monitoring the electrons that are going through the slits, the electrons behave like a wave. You get an interference pattern. However, if you monitor the electrons going through the slits, suddenly the electrons start to behave like particles. Conscious awareness changes the activity of these subatomic particles. Consciousness is strange. It's not easy to understand. One of my patients, for example, she ran over her boyfriend, and then she went 2 miles away. And when she got 2 miles away, she went to a payphone and called 911 from there. And then she went to the hospital and saw him. And when she saw him, the first thing he said was, "I saw you." And then he quoted her 911 conversation word for word. Now, what hasn't been explained here by the other side is how do you explain these sorts of situations? You can say, well, they could have talked to one another. There could be some other thing. But from a common sense perspective, you're setting the bar very, very high here. Now, in addition, other lines of evidence are like this. What about the fact that something that I mentioned earlier, with children and very young children, they have every element of the near-death experience that older people have. Older people have more religious education and so forth, but you know what? It doesn't matter about religious education, because whether a person is religious or irreligious, the same frequency of near-death experience occurs. Whether they know about near-death experience or not, the same time they occur. And with regard to the young and the old, young people, predominantly when they see people, they are predominantly dead people, just like old people at the same percentage. How do you explain that? Why these vivid experiences aren't just they see a light like where the retina just loses blood and there's this bright light. It's not just a bright light. It's bright light. It's incredible colors. It's foliage. It's nature. It's this person who says it's not your time. If you want to see a bunch of these cases, watch I Survived Beyond and Back. It comes on the Biography Channel every Sunday. Okay, and there's tons of these things. But one of the things you hear over and over again is this authority figure, usually a male voice or a person who says, it's not your time, you have to go back. There's the work that you have to do still. That's a very common experience. These are not the signs of a dying brain. These are specific movies that are very, very common.
Dr. Palavalli, please.
Before I really explain, let me just make myself understand what you're saying by evidence.
Yes.
What is evidence to you?
Evidence to me is something that validates a particular claim.
Okay. Let's stop there. So you have an assumption, you have a belief, and if something validates that, you call it evidence, if I understand it right.
Yes.
Okay. In science, that's not evidence. In science, it is a claim that is objectively verifiable and repeated consistently. That's in science. I'll give you a very simple.
I have a PhD and an MBA. I know what science is.
Let me give you a very simple example, very simple explanation. Well, first of all, this idea that it's not your time. When I was 10 years old, my grandma told me that in Indian mythology, you go to hell. Yamu, which is the lord of Yama, which is the lord of hell, is going to decide. There's a register. They're going to look and say, well, is it your time or not? And this is a very common cultural belief, very common.
But
across the cultures.
The problem is that whether people are religious or not, they're having similar experiences.
I'm sorry.
Okay, people who know nothing about this time thing are having this.
Let me come back. I said, you showed me a single slit particle experiment and a double slit particle experiment. that says the
Oh,
dual.
I just used the double.
Yeah. Well,
use the double one, yeah.
the dual behavior of electrons or the particles or the so-called electromagnetic waves or photons, are they light particles? Photons are the particles or the waves? I don't have to know that, but they behave this way when we observe through this is the way they behave. That's a fact, which means whether you look at it, I look at it, Kochavah looks at it, absolutely consistently that's how they behave. That's what consistency is, and repeatability. That's to me is evidence of existence of certain thing. And by doing that, now you can predict things. For example, nobody had an idea that you could break an atom with fission reaction and release energy equivalent to mc square.
Really, it surprised Einstein that the nature of electrons, the nature of photons would change depending on whether they were observed or not. It sounds absurd. We still don't have a good explanation for why this is. Why does observation, why is it when you measure the photons that are going through the slits that suddenly it goes from behaving like a wave to a particle? What is it about consciousness? Does it work with animals or just people? We don't understand that. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. And I think consciousness is amazing. And I don't think it's as simple as a collection of neurons working together. Even though I think it's incredible, I think the brain is the most incredible machine in the universe, I believe that there is a lot more to consciousness.
Okay, so here's a question that is postulated by Dr. Guy. How do you explain the multitude of case reports of patients that perceive they traveled away from their bodies and observed people and events in remote locations? Later, they were able to verify that the conversations and events that they recalled actually occurred. Again, this question is postulated by Dr. Guy. And Dr. Guy, do you want to expound on the question? And then Dr. Palavalli, please follow with your answer. Thank you.
For example, the clip that I had talked about a case that occurred in Europe. Dr. Pim van Lommel's case, you might be familiar with it, where the young man, well, his older man, I guess, who had a myocardial infarction in the field. They brought him to the hospital, cyanotic and in a coma. They resuscitated him and sent him to his room. Now, this individual was a part of Pimmel's, he had a study going on at the time, specifically looking at near death, and so he automatically came in, he got the EEG and so forth, and so that was all, he was part of the near death study. Many people were in the study. He was one person in the study. It was published in Lancet because what was interesting is that when he was comatose, and when they were trying to get his heart started and everything.
I'm sorry, this was a part of a study, he was comatose?
Yes, yeah, well, yeah.
How did he become comatose?
Basically, he became comatose because of the heart attack. All right, he was brought.
But he already had everything hooked up before?
No, when they brought him to the hospital, they hooked him up. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so anyway, he was resuscitated. Now, later, a nurse came into his room and he automatically recognized her, you know, because he'd been there for a while and they'd lost his teeth. They lost his false teeth. They didn't know what happened to him. And he had been in a coma when she had met him first, because she was on the resuscitation team. And so he never saw her because he was out of it at the time. And he immediately recognized her. And he says, I saw you. You tried to revive me and so forth. He says, how do you know that? You were in a coma at the time. He says, I saw you from the ceiling. I looked down on you. He says, and you took my teeth. And he's like, well, he says, yeah, you took my teeth and you put them in that cart in that drawer. And they went back and looked in the crash cart, and there were his teeth. Nobody could remember what happened to them in the excitement. And that was I mean, the results of the study were published and they're out there. But this particular case was so interesting that it got a write-up in Lancet. Now, when you have a case like that, how do you explain that? How do you explain something like that?
What happens is that we know that there are situations where you may be going into the coma and see this, and then you're comatose. Or you may be just coming out of coma and something could have happened, like taking the teeth out. You're going to still remember that. That's one possibility. But the second possibility I'm saying is that there are many, many, many instances where the patient is relatively conscious but has what's called motor paralysis. That means they can't move or say anything, and for an uncritical, unexamining professional, even if they're professional, if they're not specifically looking for function of brain, they would say the patient is unconscious, but he's not unconscious. He is just not moving, but he may be still registering and seeing. If you say this patient had an EEG hooked up to his brain in the emergency
This
room.
was part of a study.
Yeah.
Everybody that came in with cardiac problems was enrolled in this study. Okay.